Hello comrades. In this video I wanted to talk about a particularly popular anarchist argument, and this is going to be my last anarchism related video before my response to the libertarian socialist rants, which probably will come out sometime next week. One of the most common arguments that anarchists like to use is that the Soviet Union and that the other Marxist countries, they didn't achieve stateless communism, therefore they're wrong. Therefore, Marxism has failed, and that's why people need to become anarchists. Now, of course, this entire argument is based on shifting the burden of proof. It only makes sense to say that Marxism has supposedly failed because it hasn't reached stateless communism, if we assume that anarchism itself has achieved it, which it hasn't. As I've talked about in the previous two videos, the Makhnovism Ukraine video and the CNT-FAI video that I made. Anarchists claim that they have reached statelessness and that therefore anyone else should also be able to do it. But of course it's not true. They haven't reached statelessness themselves. So this argument kind of falls apart already. But I think it is a valid question to ask why the Soviet Union and Marxist countries in general didn't achieve stateless communism or full communism. Why not? The answer is fairly simple, but somehow it seems to be, I don't know, too much for anarchists to be able to grasp. Basically, if we look at the different components of what a state is, such as the most obvious sort of oppressive mechanisms and monopoly on violence, such as the police force, intelligence service, and the military. Well, why did the Soviet Union still have its military? I mean, when you ask that question, it becomes fairly obvious why. Because it was during the Cold War. They were in basically constant arms race and preparation for war against the West, and they were fighting continuous proxy wars all over the world. Basically, they were in constant military conflict. Not to mention that before that, Germany of course invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was only able to defeat Germany because it had a strong military. Before that, the Soviet Union had a war with Finland, which was a hostile right-wing White Guard government, as well as with Poland, which was a hostile right-wing fascist government, as well as with Japan. Japan invaded in 1938, and Japan was of course an ally of Nazi Germany. And way before that even, the Soviet Union had to fight against the so-called Allied intervention, which was when 14 capitalist countries invaded Russia in 1918 to 1920, basically the Russian Civil War. So it is kind of a stupid question to ask, why did they still have the military? Well, because they were at constant war, trying to defend themselves. Well, why did they still have the police? Why did they still have the secret service or the intelligence service, whatever? Same basic reason. There was constantly internal enemies trying to overthrow them. Capitalist infiltration, capitalist spies. It's like when people wonder why did East Germany focus so much on espionage and stuff like that, and counter-espionage. Well, I mean, because Berlin at the time was considered literally the espionage capital of the world. I did not invent that term. Historians invented the term. Espionage capital of the world. And you know, it's fairly obvious why that is. I mean, Berlin was inside the Western controlled area, but it was still, Berlin itself was still controlled by East Germany. So, you know, that makes it a very vulnerable target. But enough of that. I mean, you should be able to understand by now why the Soviet Union still had its military, like a standing army, and why did it have the police and all these things. Then there's of course the economic aspect to it as well. Again, I recommend that you go watch my video on the withering away of the state. But basically, the state doesn't wither away, and you can't really get rid of certain aspects of the state until you are basically economically developed enough. There's certain functions the state needs to perform, and until you are basically at a stage where those are not necessary anymore, then you can get rid of the state. You know, usually when people talk about the state, they focus on the violent aspects, or like, you know, things like the police force and the military. But you know, there's some other things, like there's a reason why state bureaucracy and state officials and state administrative functions, why those exist. It's because those things need to be done, and you know, in statelessness those things need to be replaced with something. basically look at it this way. In the Marxist view, you can get to full communism, full stateless communism, in the economic sense, when there's no scarcity of resources, basically. And that is how you get rid of money. People in full communism, people wouldn't be paid money. Instead, they would work for free, but they would also get what they need from the store, just like free. They could go there and get what they want. Now that requires two things. It requires that people will understand that they need to behave differently in this new system. They can't just go to the store and just take tons of stuff they don't need and then hoard it. They can't like take a new car each day and just crash it. Second of all, it also requires that we are at a good enough economic situation and that we are basically able to produce a lot of stuff. Produce so much that there's enough for everyone, even without rationing. Of course, in the transition period to this system, there would still be some kind of rationing, and if the system at first didn't work, then we would have to revert back to rationing. But, you know, in the end, it should work without any kind of rationing. People would realize that, you know, there's no point in taking stuff that they don't need and then hoarding it, because what would they do with it? They can't sell it, nobody would buy it, because you can get it for free from the store anyway, so what's the point? So people would learn to live in a new way, but basically that kind of thing is not possible if you're still in pretty extreme scarcity, if there's still barely enough food for people, like in the Spanish Civil War, if there's still noticeable social inequality, if you try to basically stamp out the use of money, but instead of replacing it with post-scarcity and an economy based on post-scarcity, if you instead try to replace it with basically with this system of harsh rationing, which is pretty interesting because that's what anarchists want to do, but it's actually pretty authoritarian. It won't work. You can replace money with post-scarcity. It works naturally. If there's post-scarcity, then money, the use of money will wither away, because there's no need to use money anymore. There's no point in using money anymore. And that is what the withering away of the state is all about. It will wither away because it becomes totally, you know, superfluous, totally pointless and useless. But if there's still use for money, and you just try to like legislate a ban on money, you just ban money, it won't get rid of money. It just makes money illegal. People are still gonna use money. They're going to use black market currency. Not to mention that, of course, the anarchists, they didn't even really get rid of money. They kind of half-assedly got rid of money. They got rid of actual money in some of their localities, not all of them. But even in the places where they got rid of it, they replaced it with labor vouchers, which are pretty much just money. It's just more worthless kind of money. You know, labor vouchers are still a currency, but they're just a weaker currency. You know, labor vouchers, you could only use labor vouchers for certain things, and you could only theoretically earn labor vouchers by working. That's why they're called labor vouchers. Like, you perform labor and then you earn them. But what is to stop people from trading labor vouchers in the black market, or simply using another currency like US dollars or European euros, or whatever the closest big currency would be? Like, if this were to take place in Ukraine, they would probably use rubles. So to basically recap, the Soviet Union didn't reach stateless communism because it didn't defeat its enemies. It was basically in a massive arms race with the entire capitalist world, preparing for a war with the capitalist world, and trying to defend itself from the capitalist world. So it's kind of crazy to think that they should just disarm themselves, and it's also very naive to think that they could defend themselves using purely anarchistic methods, especially since the anarchists themselves have never been able to do such a thing. And the Soviet Union didn't get rid of money or other such things, and didn't reach full stateless communism economically, because they basically had to spend so much of their money on other things like weapons and competing with the capitalists. I mean, the revisionist Soviet Union, of course, they made economic mistakes in other regards, but even had they followed a correct political line economically, they still wouldn't have reached stateless communism at that stage. Maybe they would have been more closer to it economically, but there was still the military aspect to it, which pretty much prevented them from reaching statelessness until they had defeated capitalism. So really, the short answer to the question why didn't the Soviet Union reach statelessness is because they didn't defeat capitalism on a world scale. Because the tide of revolution kind of turned in the 60s. Until pretty much the late 60s, the Soviet Union was growing. It was growing economically at a massive rate. it was gaining ground, defeating the capitalist world, one battle at a time. But after that, because of the revisionist policy, revisionist foreign policy, they kind of stopped gaining ground. Because of revisionist economic policy, their economy slowed its growth and stagnated. So basically, had they kept following a correct political line, they probably would have defeated capitalism. They would have caught up with the capitalist world and then overcome the capitalist world, which is what the CIA was very concerned that the Soviets were going to overtake them at any moment. So it wasn't a totally unrealistic expectation. I mean, the Soviets and the socialist camp did control half the population and half the territory on the earth anyway. So it wasn't crazy to think that they would not only catch up with capitalists but also defeat them. And if they had defeated them, then spending so many resources on militarization wouldn't have been needed anymore. Things like the military and all these things, they wouldn't have been as necessary anymore. Problem with anarchism is that they don't have the patience for this. They want to just get rid of those things right away, and it doesn't work, as we have seen time and time again.